Welcome to the first post in the Pine and Bow Quilt Along. I am Carolyn Friedlander, and I am so excited for those of you who are joining us as we're quilting along for the next few weeks on two of my projects, Pine and Bow. This week we're going to be focusing on pine, so each week we're going to kind of switch between these two different projects, and so pick one or work on both, whatever you're kind of excited about. I'm pretty excited that we have two projects that are so different from each other. Pine is a foundation paper piece project, whereas Bow is an applique project, so they're totally different. To me, they both suit totally different moods. With Pine, it's about kind of sitting down at the sewing machine and going through with that. And then with the Bow project, that is an applique project, which of course you could use any kind of applique technique that you'd like, be it by machine or by hand. For me, I'm going to be doing hand applique, so that kind of checks the box for me for like super relaxing, end of the day kind of sewing. So it's nice to have the balance of both. In this first post, we are going to be talking about pine and picking your fabrics. So I've already put together a post with some thoughts, so if you want to check out the blog for thoughts on some of the first versions that I've made, you can check that out. I'm going to talk about them here too, but then I'm really excited to show you the fabrics that I've pulled for my project. So we're going to talk about the fabric, and I don't know, such a fun part of the project is picking out the fabrics and thinking about your colors. So to start, I've got both versions of pine that I've made so far. Pine, it's inspired by trees. When I moved into my house, I just planted a whole bunch of trees. In fact, I have 3 pine trees waiting outside now that I hope to plant soon. I love pine trees because they grow really fast. They have such a beautiful shape. There's so many different varieties of them. And there's something about when they grow, they just have this like very perky, display of leaves and branches as they're just budding out. Like in the spring, it's actually happening right now, where you get these little like bursts of the new growth. And so it's kind of exciting. So this project is inspired by that fun, perky shape. And pine is the, I think, third tree pattern of mine. And this one features the smallest blocks. So the pattern itself has 2 different sized block options. So there's the tiny block, which is this one, and then there's the less tiny block, which is this one. So you can kind of see, now that I have them side by side, the difference. If we look at the versions that I've made already, both of these were made using my Friedlander fabric collection, which in many ways was also a tree-inspired collection. But I would say both of these, even though they're worked from the same fabric collection, they're kind of a scrappy approach. There's not an overall order to all of my trees being the same color, or even all of the trees being, I've got a lot of this orange tree, but they're not even evenly like distributed across my quilt. There's sort of an imbalance, which I like. And I know that as I made these, I laid them out, and I just liked the balance of this. I didn't want it to have perfect symmetry. I liked that you kind of have higher and lower levels of contrast, and I like how that kind of creates some depth. Something else with this one, I like how the orange really pops. I also used the same blue that I used for the border, and I think that brings kind of a nice like harmony between the blocks and the border. And it's kind of a mixy background. On this one, this is the bigger block, so you can see the size difference. This one too, they're not perfectly ordered, but it's a pretty cohesive color palette with really warm shades. So I've got some oranges and pale pinks and yellows. This one definitely has more of like a yellow wasabi tone to it, and a lighter background, which gives it a different look. The blue background, or the blue border on this one, really frames the blocks, whereas this lighter background helps some of these backgrounds blend into the border. It doesn't give it such a hard frame around the blocks. So yeah, this one too, I changed it up. Not all of my trees are the darker fabric. Sometimes I have the darker fabric in the background and the lighter fabric as the tree. I think it's fun to kind of mix these up. So that's these are the two that I've made so far. And one thing that I'm really excited about for my new project, the one I'm going to be working on for the Quilt Along, is that initially I thought about just going scrappy again. This is such a great scrap project because it uses, you can use such small pieces of fabric. Yeah, but then I realized I was putting together a newsletter, I was gathering some images from a newsletter. I was in Sarasota a couple of weeks ago for a sewing retreat, which was awesome, and I managed to make my way over to the Ringling Museum, which is a beautiful museum on the coast. I haven't been there since I was in high school, and so it was really neat to see a familiar space that I hadn't been to in a long time. One thing that I loved about it, though, is it's this, I don't know when the building was built, but there were just these beautiful like archways. It was quite dramatic and in really pretty shades of like pink, and just being on the coast, it's like a totally different color palette. So I gathered a collage of images that I took while I was there at the museum, and I just really like the color palette of those. So that is my starting point for my project. So kind of my goal for myself is to try to stick to a color palette. Even though the other two versions I've made do have a very like defined color palette, this one I see as being more monochromatic, and I don't know, I want to show some restraint with the extra things that I'm editing. So this is kind of what I pulled based on the images that I put together. I just grabbed a bunch of different, creams and peaches, some solids, some linen, some of my prints, some yarn dyes, wovens. So I don't know, this is just a really good starting point. And I think that I want to rely on these not just for my backgrounds, but for my trees as well. So one thing that I'm looking at is some of these close pairings and how, these shades of, this is like a dusty mauve, and this is like a vibrant, I think this is cantaloupe. Yeah, cantaloupe, Kona cotton cantaloupe. And I like how this is so saturated and this is so dull. So I kind of want to play on some of those pairings in my blocks. And then also in this image group, one thing that I really like is that there are pops of other things. So the bright blue in the sky, and then the black that's in some of the artwork in that one image. So I don't know that I'll use all of these. In fact, I'm not sure about this lighter one, but I like having, a very bright blue that I could pop in. And again, I'm not sure, maybe I'll make a tree, or maybe I'll have a limb that's made out of this. I don't know, I'm not sure, because I really do want the palette to be predominantly pink and peach, but I do like having these accents. So I also pulled, mostly these are my fabrics. This one's black and peach, which is great. And then some black, and this is actually a dark green. And then this was another scrap that I had laying around. Yeah, so I don't know. I think these will give me some options to play around with. Yeah, so I'm pretty excited about that. So as you kind of think about your project and the fabrics that you're pulling, I don't know, either go to your scrap pile or go through kind of the images on your phone, things that have stood out to you lately. That's what I did, and that's where I found some good inspiration. And that can be a perfect starting off point for your project. And the nice thing the important thing to remember is that you don't have to stick to this. This is just a starting point. And so the next thing is, as I start sewing my blocks, I'll be asking myself if I like the direction that it's going, what's most exciting, what am I most curious about, and then I'm going to push it further in that direction. I might keep looking back to my inspiration photos, just kind of asking myself the same thing, like, what is it that I like about these photos? Is it, for me, I think it is just the variety of those shades of pink and peach. and just the mood that creates. And then as I'm making my blocks, I'll say, well, is this kind of creating that same feeling, that same, I don't know, that same thing that I'm enjoying about the photo. So yeah, with this quilt along, I was thinking it would be really fun to incorporate more of a dialogue with you directly, and those of you following along. So each week I will be answering 3 questions from you. They can have to do with the quilt along, they can have to do with other things, kind of whatever's on your mind, and then I'll just be selecting 3 each week to answer those in these posts. The question form, I'll link that below, as well as links to the patterns, links to the blog post, all of that kind of stuff will be in the description below. But yeah, so this week I have 3 questions. And so the first one comes from Diane, and she says, I would love some tips on making bow. I made one and am a very experienced quilter, and yet each bow is a little off. I use the templates. So that's a pretty good question. And I know, Diane, you mentioned you have a lot of experience, so that's great. I don't know exactly which approach you were doing, but for me, one thing that's super important for getting a nice fluid curve in the case of bow is to be paying attention to your basting stitches. So I like to use a basting stitch that acts as my guide for turning my raw edge under. And I find that if you have a nice, smooth, accurate basting stitch that mirrors the shape that you're wanting to applique, that helps you get a much smoother result in the end. So if that's the approach that you're using, I would just say keep practicing, because you'll get better with practice, but also like pay attention to that basting stitch, because it really, I mean, it seems like the basting could be, I mean, it literally is a throwaway aspect because you'll remove it after you're done. But it's such an important tool in the process because you're using it as your guide for turning your edges under. So just make sure that it's smooth and, you know, mirroring those shapes, and that it's, you know, an accurate distance from your edge, that it just gives you the right amount of space for turning your fabric under. So yeah, I'd take a look at that basting stitch. That would be my tip. Okay, Sarah asks, are there times you think machine applique looks great? Ways to adapt your stunning projects to machine applique that still look incredible? It's a really good question. And yeah, so this is a great question because first of all, applique does not have to be done by hand. You can absolutely do it by machine. You can do it, even if you're doing it by hand, you don't need to do it needle turn. Whatever way is comfortable and works well for you, go for it. That's something I love about quilting, is just that there are so many different ways to get to the end result. So, yeah, so I just brought I pulled a couple of samples to show. And I should just say, I don't have a ton of experience doing doing machine applique. So I'm sure there are other people that have more and better techniques or a different, you know, better suggestion. But I just wanted to show you a couple of ways that I've done it. This is my clay quilt that I made using fusible appliques. So I applied a fusible to the back of my fabrics, cut out my shapes, placed them on my project, and then ironed them. So activated that fusible so that they would adhere to the back of the fabric, and then I just quilted over it. So the quilting itself, the machine quilting, holds all of those things in place. That's kind of what I did here. This is also a sample of my hunt project that I did using the same way. So I added a fusible to the back of the fabrics that I was using for the applique, cut out my shapes, ironed it on, and then I did a lot of matchstick quilting on top. So this one is on a pretty thin batting. So I don't know, it is softer. One of the things that, you know, I don't necessarily like as much using like a fusible product is, one, it can gum up your needle, and two, it does add like a thickness to your project that can be less pleasant. But if you're making a wall hanging or a bag or something that you want to have extra body, that could really work in your favor. So this is just one way that I've done machine applique, but I know there are a bunch of other ways. And they can look great. So whatever works, absolutely, go for that. All right, next up is Margaret, and she says that I have completed the Grove pattern and have some issues with the quilting. I tried quilting each tree separately, but did not like it. I see that you have quilting vertical lines on yours. That may be easier, although I would like to quilt each tree separately. Any ideas? I thought that this was a really great question. Margaret's asking about my Grove quilt, which is another tree project. This is a good question because we're going to be quilting pine too. So let's take a look at Grove. This is another one of my tree projects. It's called Grove. It's also foundation paper pieced. The quilting on this one is, I did this all with free motion quilting in straight-ish lines. So I did all my ditch work around all my trees because I want them to kind of pop. I like that the quilting can emphasize a shape. With pine, I did the same thing. These are both pretty similar approaches in that I outlined all of these little trees first, and then I went back in and did some straightish lines just to kind of fill the backgrounds. And so that was kind of the order that I did. I outlined everything, and then I went in and filled in these straight lines. Just kind of whatever works for me. It's nice to be able to change directions. It keeps it a little bit more entertaining. If you get bored going in one direction, you can turn and go in another. But yeah, so that's what I did. Anytime you're kind of doing machine quilting, I feel like you want to start with the bigger ideas first and then get more refined as you go along. So that's why I started by outlining all of my shapes. With this one, I did outline my, I did do the ditches for my border because I really liked the idea of this border framing all of my pieced blocks. And then I went in and got a little tighter, did all of my background stuff, and then I did like a grid on the border. So something to think about. And that's basically what I did here too. Outlined everything, and then I did free motion quilting to fill all the different spaces. So anyway, I hope that's really helpful. And don't forget, you can ask questions. So I've got the link to that below. I've got a link to these different projects down below. And make sure to post your projects on Instagram using the hashtag PineBowQAL for Quilt Along. And so we'll be able to see those. I can't wait to see what you're making. And thanks so much for joining us. Make sure to subscribe to get all of the updates. You can also subscribe to my newsletter. I'll have links for all of that below. So thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.